It all began in the quiet cul-de-sac of Maplewood Lane, where life was supposed to be simple, neighborly, and free from unnecessary drama. The houses were almost identical, each boasting neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and trees that were strategically planted to offer both shade and aesthetics. But what seemed like a peaceful suburban dream was about to spiral into a series of events no one could have predicted. In this neighborhood, there were two families that stood out, not because of wealth or extravagance, but because of the rivalry that simmered between them. On one side lived the Martins, a family known for their small but flourishing backyard garden. Their pride was a mango tree that had been planted years ago by the grandfather, now bearing fruit so sweet that even people across town craved a taste. On the other side lived the Harpers, who didn't have mangoes but had an equally prized apple tree, one that had been passed down for generations. Its red, glossy apples were almost too perfect to be real, and every autumn the Harpers bragged about their family recipe of apple pies that neighbors looked forward to. The rivalry began innocently. A child from the Harper family once crossed over to the Martins' yard, plucked a mango without asking, and bit into it right there in front of them. The Martins were furious, claiming that it was disrespectful, while the Harpers insisted it was just a child being curious. Words were exchanged, and what could have been brushed off as childish mischief became the spark of a feud. Over time, the tension grew. The Martins accused the Harpers of letting their apple tree's branches cross over into their yard, dropping leaves that littered the carefully maintained garden. The Harpers fired back, saying the mango tree's roots were creeping under their fence, threatening to crack the pavement of their driveway. Neighbors tried to intervene, but soon the entire street seemed divided, Team Mango versus Team Apple. It wasn't just about fruit anymore. Every neighborhood meeting became a battlefield, with both families airing out grievances. The Martins claimed that apples were overrated, too sour compared to the sweetness of mangoes. The Harpers countered that mangoes were messy, sticky, and nothing compared to the crisp perfection of apples. What began as playful comparisons turned into heated arguments that left the community walking on eggshells. Despite the drama, there was something ironic about this rivalry. Behind all the bitterness, both families actually admired the other's fruits in secret. The Harpers often bought mangoes at the store, wishing they could grow them as well as the Martins did. Meanwhile, the Martins quietly loved apple pies and sometimes baked them at home, but never admitted it out loud. Pride had taken over, and both families refused to back down. One summer evening, the feud reached a boiling point. A storm had swept through Maplewood Lane, knocking branches from both the mango and apple trees. When the rain cleared, broken branches and scattered fruits littered both yards. Instead of working together to clean up, the Martins accused the Harpers of letting their tree grow too wild, while the Harpers claimed the mango tree's branches were the real culprit. Voices rose, neighbors gathered, and the argument became the talk of the entire HOA. The HOA, desperate to keep the peace, called a special meeting. Rules were read aloud about property lines, tree maintenance, and neighborly conduct. But the damage was done. Everyone could feel it. This rivalry wasn't going away anytime soon. And yet, deep down, something unexpected was about to happen. While both families were busy pointing fingers, their children, who had grown up watching these petty fights, were beginning to see things differently. They didn't care whether mangoes were better than apples. They cared about friendship, about laughter, and about not repeating the mistakes of their parents. Little did anyone know, this feud that started over fruits was about to take a dramatic turn. A new event was on the horizon, one that would test loyalties, change perspectives, and bring the entire neighborhood into the same storm once again. Because while fruit had divided them, a wedding was about to bring them together. Or at least that was the plan, until Karen got involved. The neighborhood had been fractured for so long that most people assumed the Martins and the Harpers would never see eye to eye. But time has a strange way of softening even the sharpest edges. And the turning point came with an unexpected announcement. One crisp autumn morning, invitations began circulating through Maplewood Lane. The Harper family was hosting a wedding. Their eldest daughter, Emily, was getting married. It wasn't just any wedding. It was to be the grandest celebration Maplewood had seen in years. String lights, floral arches, and a reception planned right in the Harpers' sprawling backyard. The whole neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. Even the Martins, who had once vowed to never step foot on Harper property again, received an invitation. At first they were skeptical, muttering that it was probably a formality, a show of courtesy rather than genuine goodwill. But when Emily herself came over to hand them the envelope, her sincerity was undeniable. She smiled warmly and told them that family feuds had no place in her new beginning. Her words carried a weight that neither the Martins nor the Harpers could ignore. Slowly the bitterness began to fade. The Martins agreed to attend, and soon both families found themselves working side by side in the preparations. The Martins' mango tree, which had once been a point of contention, suddenly became a centerpiece of the wedding decor. Golden mangoes were harvested and turned into bright tropical centerpieces for the tables. Meanwhile, the Harpers' apple tree contributed its bounty to a dessert table filled with fresh pies, candied apples, and sparkling cider. For the first time in years, both fruits stood side by side, not as rivals but as symbols of unity. The neighborhood, too, seemed to change with this shift. Neighbors who had once taken sides began mingling freely again, laughing at how silly the old arguments had been. Some joked that the wedding was more than just a union of two people. It was the union of mango and apple, a truce carved into the heart of Maplewood Lane. As the preparations continued, something even more surprising happened. The children of both families, who had grown tired of the constant hostility, began to spend more time together. They discovered common interests, shared jokes, and even began helping one another with decorations. The Martins' youngest son climbed ladders to hang lanterns, while the Harpers' youngest daughter painted signs and arranged flowers. Their teamwork stood in stark contrast to the years of division their parents had enforced. By the time the wedding day arrived, the atmosphere was nothing short of magical. White chairs were lined neatly in rows across the Harper lawn, their apple tree adorned with fairy lights that twinkled like stars. Across the yard, the mangoes from the Martins' tree shone like golden orbs in bowls scattered across the tables. Music floated through the air, laughter rippled across the crowd, and for a moment, Maplewood Lane seemed like a paradise where grudges had no place. The Martins, though still cautious, couldn't deny the warmth they felt. Watching their mangoes being enjoyed by neighbors they hadn't spoken to in years filled them with a quiet pride. For the Harpers, seeing the Martins' contributions honored alongside their own was humbling. Both families realized that their stubbornness had cost them years of joy and community. Now, standing together under the open sky, they finally felt the weight of reconciliation. It was almost too perfect. A feud that had begun over fruit was finally giving way to something bigger, a chance at healing, at unity, at moving forward. For once, the Martins and the Harpers could look across the fence without hostility, seeing neighbors instead of enemies. But perfection rarely lasts long in Maplewood Lane, because among the guests, standing with arms folded and eyes narrowed, was someone who thrived not on peace but on chaos. Her name was Karen, and she was already whispering complaints before the ceremony even began. She scoffed at the seating arrangement, criticized the decorations, and muttered about how the mango centerpieces were too messy for a wedding. Every smile, every laugh, every symbol of unity seemed to irritate her more and more. The neighbors didn't pay much attention at first. After all, Karen was always like this, complaining about HOA fees, nitpicking over lawn heights, or filing reports about dogs barking too loudly. But this time Karen wasn't just annoyed. She was plotting. The Martins and Harpers had fought for years, and now that they were finally coming together, Karen saw an opportunity. She thrived on conflict, and the thought of peace settling over Maplewood Lane didn't sit well with her. In her eyes, drama kept her relevant, her voice loud and her influence strong. As the first notes of wedding music began to play, Karen's frown deepened. She could feel the unity in the air, and it infuriated her. The Martins and Harpers had no idea that the day meant to seal their truce would soon unravel in ways none of them could have imagined, and it would be Karen, the woman who always knew how to stir trouble, who made sure of it. The wedding had begun with a glow that seemed to wash over the entire neighborhood. Guests sat under a canopy of string lights. The bride walked down the aisle with grace, and the groom's eyes sparkled with joy. For the Martins and Harpers, it was more than just a marriage. It was a symbol that even the deepest grudges could be healed. For a while, it seemed as if everything was finally right in Maplewood Lane. But lurking in the background was Karen, her sharp gaze scanning the scene with an air of superiority. She had always believed she was the guardian of Maplewood, the unspoken leader of its standards. If she didn't approve of something, she made sure everyone knew. And today she disapproved of nearly everything. It started small. Karen marched over to the dessert table and declared that the mango slices were dripping juice onto the tablecloth, calling it unsanitary. When no one listened, she muttered louder, drawing a few uneasy glances. Then she turned her attention to the apple pies, insisting they weren't up to HOA health standards, because they hadn't been purchased from a licensed bakery. The Harpers tried to brush it off, but her constant complaining began to unsettle some of the guests. Karen wasn't just complaining for the sake of it. She wanted to create cracks to remind everyone of the old rivalries. She leaned into the Martins and whispered that the Harpers were only pretending to be friendly for the sake of appearances. Then she drifted to the Harpers, suggesting the Martins were showing off their mangoes to overshadow the apples. Karen's words were like poison, subtle enough to sound like concern, but dangerous enough to reignite old doubts. The bride and groom, oblivious at first, focused on their vows and the joy of the moment. But even they couldn't ignore the growing murmurs in the crowd. Neighbors who had once laughed together now exchanged uneasy glances, wondering if the peace between the families was as fragile as Karen claimed. Karen thrived on the tension. Every time she saw someone frown or whisper, she felt a rush of satisfaction. But she wasn't done yet. During the reception, as people danced and enjoyed the food, Karen took things further. She approached the sound system, fiddling with the controls until the music cut out mid-song. Gasps rippled across the lawn as the joyful atmosphere faltered. Karen stepped back, pretending to be shocked, but her smirk gave her away. Faulty equipment, she muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear, probably because the Martins insisted on using those mango crates to hold up the speakers. Completely unsafe. The Martins stiffened, their pride wounded. The Harpers looked at them, unsure if it was true, and for a brief moment the old rivalry seemed ready to spark again. Karen watched with glee, waiting for tempers to explode. But then something unexpected happened. The bride stepped forward, her voice firm but calm, and reminded everyone why they were gathered. Not for fruits, not for rivalries, and certainly not for pettiness. The music was fixed, the laughter returned, and for a brief time Karen's disruption was forgotten. Still, Karen wasn't discouraged. If anything, she was emboldened. She realized she needed something bigger, something that couldn't be smoothed over with a speech. She scanned the yard, her mind racing with possibilities. And then she saw it. The centerpiece of the unity between the Martins and Harpers, the fruit display. Mangoes and apples side by side, symbolizing peace. Karen knew exactly what to do. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the wedding, Karen slipped quietly toward the fruit display. With deliberate care, she knocked over a bowl of mangoes, sending them tumbling into the apple pies below. Juice splattered, crusts broke apart, and the once perfect table was now a sticky, chaotic mess. Gasps erupted as guests turned to see the disaster. Karen wasted no time. She raised her voice loud and accusatory, claiming that the Martins had deliberately sabotaged the Harpers' desserts. She spun a tale of jealousy, saying the Martins couldn't stand to see apples take the spotlight. The Harpers' relatives bristled, and before long, words were exchanged. The fragile peace began to unravel. The Martins protested their innocence, but Karen kept fueling the fire, twisting every word to pit the families against each other. Neighbors began choosing sides again, their laughter replaced with suspicion. The unity that had seemed so strong only hours earlier was dissolving right before their eyes. And at the center of it all, Karen stood tall, watching the chaos unfold with a glint of triumph. The wedding that had promised healing was now on the verge of becoming a battlefield. And unless someone acted quickly, Maplewood Lane was about to return to the bitter, divided days of the past. What had started as the most beautiful day in Maplewood Lane was unraveling faster than anyone could control. The mess at the fruit table, the harsh words exchanged, and Karen's constant stirring had shifted the wedding from joy to chaos. The Martins stood defensively near the mango bowls, while the Harpers clustered around the ruined apple pies, each side glaring as though old wounds had been ripped wide open. The bride and groom tried to calm everyone, but their voices were drowned out by the rising tide of accusations. Guests who had once cheered and clapped were now murmuring angrily, debating whose fault it was. Karen walked among them like a conductor leading an orchestra of conflict. Her words subtle but perfectly placed to fan the flames. Typical Martins, always thinking they're better with their tropical fruits, she whispered to one group. Can't trust the Harpers either. They've always looked down on everyone, she told another. Each seed of doubt she planted grew quickly, fueled by years of rivalry that had never fully healed. Within minutes, the crowd was split down the middle, neighbors choosing sides, families pulling away from one another, and the air thick with tension. The breaking point came when one of the Harper cousins, furious about the destroyed pies, accused the Martins of trying to ruin the wedding on purpose. The Martins, already humiliated by the accusations, snapped back that the Harpers were just jealous their mangoes were more popular than the apples. That one statement was enough to shatter any fragile truce left. Voices rose, shouts echoed, and soon neighbors who had been laughing together hours before were pointing fingers and shouting insults. Plates were knocked over, drinks spilled, and the once elegant reception lawn looked more like the aftermath of a storm than a wedding celebration. Karen stood at the center, pretending to be shocked, but inside she was delighted. This was exactly what she had wanted. The Martins and Harpers back at each other's throats, the neighborhood divided, and her influence stronger than ever. For years, she had thrived on keeping people dependent on her voice of authority. Peace threatened to make her irrelevant. But now she had restored the drama she craved. The bride's tears fell silently as she watched her perfect day collapse. The groom clenched his fists, furious that something meant to unite their families was tearing them apart instead. But no matter how hard they tried to call for calm, no one was listening. The neighbors were too busy reliving years of grudges, and Karen's whispers of blame kept the fire burning. And then it happened. In the middle of the chaos, one of the Martins picked up a fallen mango and tossed it in frustration. It hit a Harper cousin squarely in the chest, splattering juice across his shirt. Gasps filled the air, but before anyone could stop it, a Harper grabbed an apple and hurled it back. The next moment, the reception exploded into what could only be described as a full-blown fruit fight. Mangoes and apples flew across the lawn. Guests ducked and screamed, and tables toppled as people used them for cover. The carefully arranged decorations were torn apart. The music stopped again, and laughter erupted, not from joy, but from the sheer absurdity of the spectacle. What had begun as rivalry over fruit had now escalated into an actual battle fought with mangoes and apples. Karen, of course, didn't throw anything herself. She stood back, arms crossed, enjoying the sight of neighbors destroying one another while she remained untouched. To her, it was proof of what she had always believed. Peace in Maplewood was an illusion, and conflict was the only constant. But not everyone saw it that way. Amid the flying fruit and chaos, some neighbors began to realize the absurdity of what was happening. They looked at the bride and groom, heartbroken, standing in the middle of the mess, and guilt began to creep in. Was this really what Maplewood had become? A place where even a wedding couldn't survive without conflict? The fruit fight slowed as exhaustion set in, but the damage was already done. The lawn was covered in smashed fruit, the tables were overturned, and the unity that had been so carefully built was shattered once more. The Martins and Harpers stood on opposite sides, breathing heavily, eyes full of resentment. And through it all, Karen smiled. To her, it was a victory. She had managed to take the happiest day in the neighborhood and twist it into chaos. But what she didn't realize was that her victory wouldn't last. Because in the ashes of the ruined wedding, a new determination was beginning to form, one that would turn the tide against her. The Martins and Harpers, though still angry, would soon realize they had been played. And when they did, Karen's reign of chaos over Maplewood Lane would be in more danger than she could ever imagine. The reception lawn was a battlefield, sticky fruit pulp smeared across chairs, broken plates scattered underfoot, and decorations hanging limp and ruined. The bride stood at the center of it all, her once perfect dress stained with mango juice and apple bits. The groom held her hand tightly, his jaw clenched in silent rage. Around them, the Martins and Harpers glared across the lawn, their old rivalry rekindled, their voices hoarse from shouting. And then, a silence settled. Not because the anger had vanished, but because exhaustion had taken its place. Guests stood in awkward clusters, looking down at the mess they had created. The air was heavy with regret, though no one was ready to admit it out loud. In that silence, One voice cut through, the voice of Karen. She stepped forward, shaking her head dramatically as if she were the only sane person among them. "This," she declared, "is exactly what happens when certain families can't control themselves." Her words, dripping with superiority, were meant to push the final wedge between the Martins and Harpers. But something in her tone, something smug and triumphant, struck a chord in the crowd. For the first time that day, people really listened, not just to her words, but to the way she said them. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Green, frowned. She had noticed earlier how Karen had been moving from group to group, whispering things just before tempers flared. Another neighbor, Mr. Lewis, remembered seeing Karen near the sound system when the music had cut out. And then there was young Anna Harper, who swore she had seen Karen near the fruit display just before it collapsed. Slowly, suspicion began to shift, not between the Martins and Harpers, but toward Karen herself. The bride, tears still fresh on her cheeks, looked at Karen with new clarity. She replayed the day in her mind, connecting the dots. The complaints about the mangoes, the comments about the apple pies, the smirk when the music failed. It all added up. Karen hadn't been an innocent bystander. She had been the puppet master. The groom spoke first, his voice sharp with accusation. Though he didn't shout, the firmness of his tone carried weight. He asked Karen why she had been near the fruit table moments before it collapsed. Karen froze for a second, then quickly deflected, claiming she had been helping. But the neighbors weren't convinced. Too many people had seen too much. The Martins, still defensive from the accusations, looked at the Harpers and, for the first time in years, saw the same realization in their eyes. They hadn't ruined each other's fruits. They hadn't sabotaged the wedding. They had been manipulated, played against one another like pieces on a chessboard. And the person behind it all was standing right in front of them. Whispers spread quickly through the crowd. Karen's smug expression faltered as she felt the tide turning. The neighbors she had counted on to back her up were no longer nodding along. Instead, they were frowning, their eyes narrowing in suspicion. The bride, gathering her courage, stepped forward and spoke, not in anger but in disappointment. She told everyone how Karen had undermined every part of the wedding, how she had whispered poison into their ears, and how she had tried to destroy the fragile peace between the families. Her words were calm, but the truth in them struck deeper than any shout could. By now, even the children of the Martins and Harpers were speaking up. They admitted how they had seen Karen sneaking around, making trouble. Their voices, innocent and honest, carried the weight of undeniable truth. Karen tried to fight back. She raised her voice, accusing everyone of ganging up on her, of twisting the story to make her the villain. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became. She was outnumbered, and the mask she had worn for so long was slipping. The Martins and Harpers, once bitter enemies, now stood side by side. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. After years of rivalry, it had taken Karen's sabotage to show them how much they had in common. Both families realized they had been pawns in her endless hunger for control and conflict. And in that moment, a quiet but powerful shift occurred. For the first time in years, the Martins didn't see the Harpers as rivals. The Harpers didn't see the Martins as enemies. Together, they saw Karen for what she really was, the true source of the chaos in Maplewood Lane. The bride looked around at the ruined reception, the smashed fruit, the broken tables, and then back at Karen. Her voice, steady despite her pain, carried a promise. Karen would not destroy this day, nor would she destroy Maplewood Lane again. The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger no longer directed at one another, but at the woman who had thrived on their division for too long. Karen's victory had slipped through her fingers. She had wanted chaos, but instead she had created unity, just not the kind she had intended. The night air was thick with the smell of crushed fruit and trampled grass. The wedding lawn, once glowing with lights and laughter, now stood as a battlefield scarred by Karen's manipulation. Yet amidst the wreckage, a powerful shift had taken place. The Martins and Harpers, who had spent years locked in a bitter feud, now stood shoulder to shoulder. The neighbors, once divided into factions, had come together with a shared understanding, and at the center of it all stood Karen, exposed, cornered and powerless. For years, Karen had thrived in the cracks of Maplewood Lane, slipping between rivalries, feeding on small disputes, and twisting words into weapons. She had built her influence not on kindness or community, but on division. But now, as every set of eyes turned toward her, she realized that her grip on the neighborhood had slipped away. The bride, her gown stained but her voice strong, spoke with a calm authority that silenced the crowd. She declared that her wedding would not be remembered for the chaos but for the truth revealed. She told everyone that while fruits had once divided them, they now stood united against the one person who had tried to tear them apart. Her words resonated not just as a bride but as a symbol of the new Maplewood Lane, one built on unity, not grudges. The groom stepped forward, demanding that Karen leave immediately. For once, Karen had no allies to back her up. Her usual smirks and sharp comebacks failed her as she saw the Martins and Harpers, her favorite pawns, glaring at her not with suspicion of each other, but with the same focused anger directed squarely at her. Karen sputtered excuses, claiming she had only been trying to help, but the neighbors had heard enough. They no longer believed her. Her reign of fear and gossip was over. With every glare, every crossed arm, every nod of agreement, it became clear. Karen was finished. Under the weight of the united neighborhood, Karen had no choice but to turn and leave. Her footsteps were heavy, her pride shattered, and though she muttered under her breath, everyone knew she had lost. For the first time, Maplewood Lane had stood together against her, and won. Once Karen was gone, a strange calm settled over the lawn. The damage was undeniable. The tables were ruined, the decorations destroyed, and the carefully planned wedding had been reduced to chaos. But there was something stronger than destruction lingering in the air, a sense of togetherness. Neighbors who had once taken sides now helped each other clean up. The Martins offered their mangoes freely to anyone who wanted them, while the Harpers shared what was left of their apple desserts. The children, sticky with fruit pulp, laughed together as they carried broken plates to the trash. The bitterness of the past had been washed away, ironically, by the very chaos Karen had tried to create. As the cleanup turned into an impromptu gathering, the bride and groom stood side by side, smiling through their exhaustion. Their wedding had not gone as planned, but in a way, it had achieved something far greater. It had ended years of rivalry, exposed the true source of Maplewood's conflicts, and united the neighborhood in a way no one had thought possible. The Martins and Harpers approached each other at last. For years, pride had kept them apart, but that night, with mango juice and apple stains still marking their clothes, they shook hands. There were no speeches, no apologies shouted across fences, just a quiet, mutual understanding. They had wasted too many years fighting over fruit when they should have been neighbors, maybe even friends. The night ended not with bitterness, but with laughter. Someone brought out a speaker and played music, and soon the neighbors were dancing barefoot on the grass, sticky and tired but happy. It wasn't the perfect wedding the Harpers had planned, but it was a memorable one, the kind of story that would be told for years to come, not as a tale of rivalry, but as the day Maplewood Lane finally came together, Karen's shadow no longer loomed over them. The Martins and Harpers no longer saw each other as enemies, and though mangoes and apples would always symbolize their differences, they now stood as a reminder that even the smallest feuds can be overcome when people choose unity over division. In the end, Maplewood Lane wasn't remembered for its fruit fight or its feuds. It was remembered for the night when a wedding, though nearly destroyed by chaos, became the foundation of peace. And as the bride and groom shared their first dance under the stars, surrounded by neighbors who had finally found common ground, it was clear the neighborhood had been transformed forever. From fighting over fruits to standing together at a wedding, the story of Maplewood Lane had come full circle.